The morning sun peeked over the rooftops, casting golden rays across a quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and freshly cut grass. Birds chirped cheerfully in the distance, their melodies blending with the occasional hum of cars passing by. It seemed like an ordinary day in this small, unassuming community, a place where everyone knew each other's names, but rarely stopped to chat. Walt Johnson shuffled along the sidewalk, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. He wore a faded jacket that had seen better days and carried a brown paper bag filled with groceries. His steps were slow but steady, weighed down not by physical exhaustion, but by years of memories, some joyful, others painful. Walt wasn't one for conversation. He preferred solitude, tending to his garden or reading books about history on his weathered porch. To most people, he was just another elderly man trying to make ends meet. But beneath his quiet exterior lay a lifetime of experiences few could fathom. As Walt turned onto Elm Street, three young men loitered near an alleyway. They leaned casually against a graffiti-covered wall, sharing cigarettes and laughter. Their leader, Marcus, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cocky grin that matched his swagger. Beside him stood two others, Jake, lanky and restless, and Chris, who always seemed eager to prove himself. Together, they were troublemakers, known for causing mischief around town. From petty thefts to bullying weaker individuals, they thrived on intimidation. When they spotted Walt approaching, Marcus nudged Jake, smirking. "Look at this guy," he said loud enough for Walt to hear. "What's he gonna do? Cane us to death?" The trio erupted into laughter, their voices echoing off the brick walls. Walt didn't react. He kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to notice them. But inside, his pulse quickened slightly. He'd faced danger before, in jungles far away, but these streets held their own kind of threat. Marcus stepped forward, blocking Walt's path. "Hey, old-timer," he called out mockingly. "Got any cash for us? Or maybe some food? You don't look like you need all that." He gestured toward the grocery bag dangling from Walt's hand. Chris snickered while Jake circled behind Walt, cutting off his escape route. Passers-by hurried past, avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to get involved. Walt stopped, leaning heavily on his cane. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, in a voice calm yet firm, he spoke. "I don't have anything worth taking," he said. "And you don't want to start something you can't finish." Marcus raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Tell me a bedtime story." His friends laughed again, emboldened by their leader's bravado. Walt sighed inwardly. These boys reminded him of soldiers he'd once trained, young, reckless, unaware of the consequences of their actions. He felt a pang of sadness for them, but knew better than to let his guard down. The tension grew thicker as Marcus moved closer, his shadow looming over Walt. Behind him, Jake and Chris exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or stand back. Walt tightened his grip on the cane, feeling its weight in his hand. Decades ago, it would have been a rifle instead of wood and metal. Would these kids understand if he told them what he'd been through? Probably not. And honestly, he didn't care to explain. For now, he simply waited, watching carefully. Whatever happened next, he would handle it, not because he sought conflict, but because sometimes peace needed protecting, even if it meant standing up to those who underestimated him. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus stepped even closer to Walt, his sneer growing wider with each passing second. The three young men formed a loose semicircle around him, their postures relaxed but menacing. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a scene out of a movie, a frail old man cornered by bullies half his age. But Walt wasn't fazed. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Marcus further. "Come on, Grandpa," Marcus taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're not gonna cry or anything, are you? Hand over what you've got, and we'll let you go." He reached out, grabbing at the paper bag in Walt's hand. Walt pulled it back sharply, his grip firm despite his apparent frailty. For a brief moment, there was silence. Only the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze and the distant hum of traffic. "I already told you," Walt said, his voice steady and low, almost too calm for the situation. "I don't have anything worth taking, and trust me when I say, you don't want to push this." Marcus froze mid-motion, his smirk faltering just slightly. There was something about the way Walt spoke, his tone measured, his gaze unwavering, that made Marcus hesitate. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like confusion. How could this old man, leaning on a cane and looking so harmless, talk to him like he had the upper hand? Jake, sensing his leader's uncertainty, decided to step in. "Man, stop playing games with him," he muttered under his breath, nudging Marcus. "Just take the stupid bag and let's go." Chris chimed in too, cracking his knuckles loudly for effect. "Yeah, dude, he ain't worth our time." But Marcus wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He took another step forward, closing the gap between himself and Walt. "Oh, really?" He shot back, his bravado returning full force. "What are you gonna do, huh? Hit me with your cane? Or maybe you think you're some kind of tough guy?" Walt didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight ever so slightly, adjusting his stance. His fingers tightened around the handle of his cane, though the movement was subtle enough that none of the thugs noticed. Years of training during his time in Vietnam had taught him how to read people, their body language, their intentions, and he could tell these boys weren't seasoned fighters. They were amateurs, relying on intimidation rather than skill. Still, they outnumbered him, and one of them now held a knife. It happened quickly. Marcus suddenly lunged forward, shoving Walt hard against the wall behind him. The impact caused Walt to stumble, and the grocery bag slipped from his grasp, spilling its contents onto the ground. Apples rolled across the pavement, and a carton of eggs cracked open, oozing yellow liquid. Marcus laughed triumphantly, while Jake and Chris joined in, clearly enjoying the spectacle. For a split second, Walt looked vulnerable. His hat tilted askew, and his breathing grew heavier. Anyone watching might have thought he was defeated. But then, something changed. His shoulders straightened, and his expression hardened. Gone was the weary old man. In his place stood someone entirely different. Someone who had faced far worse than 3 cocky teenagers. "You shouldn't have done that," Walt said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the laughter instantly. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Walt's eyes locked onto his, piercing and unyielding. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus felt a flicker of doubt creep into his mind. What are you gonna do?" Marcus stammered, trying to mask his unease with arrogance. But Walt didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the cane again, this time more deliberately. The thugs exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to expect next. Whatever they had anticipated when they picked on this elderly man, it certainly wasn't this. And just like that, the tables turned. What followed would leave a lasting impression, not just on Marcus and his friends, but on everyone who heard the story afterward. As the 3 thugs stood there, their bravado wavering for the first time, Walt's mind began to drift. It was as if the world around him slowed down, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a distant hum. The push against the wall, the spilled groceries, the knife glinting in Marcus's hand. It all seemed to blur into the background. Instead, his thoughts carried him back decades, to a place far removed from this quiet street. He saw himself as a younger man, crouched in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The air was thick with humidity, the ground muddy beneath his boots. Gunfire crackled in the distance, and the shouts of his comrades echoed through the trees. He remembered the weight of the rifle in his hands, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, and the lessons drilled into him by his commanding officers. Stay calm, assess the situation, and act decisively. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about strategy, precision, and knowing when to strike. Walt blinked, pulling himself back to the present. The memories weren't just flashes. They were reminders. Reminders of who he once was and what he was capable of. He glanced at Marcus, who still clutched the knife, though his confidence now wavered. Jake and Chris hovered uncertainly behind him, their earlier smirks replaced by cautious stares. None of them realized they were standing face to face with someone who had stared down far greater dangers than they could imagine. "You're making a mistake," Walt said again, his voice softer but laced with authority. "I've been where you are now, thinking I was untouchable, thinking no one could stop me. But life has a way of teaching you humility." Marcus frowned, gripping the knife tighter. "What are you talking about, old man? Shut up and give us your stuff." But Walt didn't flinch. His focus sharpened, his body instinctively shifting into a stance that felt familiar despite the years. The cane in his hand wasn't just a walking aid anymore. It was an extension of himself, a tool he could use if needed. His muscles tensed slightly, ready to move. He didn't want to hurt these boys, but he also knew he couldn't let them win. Not here. Not now. The moment stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, waving the knife threateningly. "Last chance," he spat, trying to sound tough. But Walt saw right through him. He noticed the slight tremble in Marcus's arm, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. These weren't hardened criminals. They were kids playing at being tough, unaware of the line they were crossing. Walt's thoughts returned to his time in the military. He remembered the camaraderie, the shared sense of purpose among his fellow soldiers. They weren't perfect men, but they understood discipline, respect, and the value of protecting others. These boys in front of him lacked that understanding. They acted without thinking, driven by fear or insecurity or whatever demons chased them. In another life, under different circumstances, Walt might have felt sorry for them. Right now, though, his priority was survival. And maybe, just maybe, teaching them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. "I warned you," Walt said finally, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Don't say I didn't try to stop this." With that, something clicked inside him. The years melted away, and the soldier he once was came rushing back. His grip on the cane tightened, his posture relaxed but alert. To anyone watching, he still looked like an ordinary old man, but in his eyes, there was a fire, a quiet determination that spoke volumes. Marcus hesitated, glancing at his friends. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. He wasn't sure what to make of this man who refused to back down, who seemed almost prepared. Before he could process it further, Walt moved. And in that instant, everything changed. The moment Walt moved, it was like watching a storm break after hours of ominous stillness. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and impossibly fast for someone his age. With a flick of his wrist, he swung the cane upward in a smooth arc, knocking the knife clean out of Marcus's hand. The blade clattered to the ground with a metallic ring, skittering out of reach. Marcus stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. "What the?" Marcus started, but before he could finish, Walt stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Using the cane as leverage, he swept it low, catching Marcus off balance. The young man yelped as he fell hard onto the pavement, landing flat on his back with a thud. Jake and Chris froze, their earlier bravado evaporating into sheer disbelief. "Hey!" Chris shouted, lunging toward Walt with clenched fists. But Walt was ready. He sidestepped effortlessly, using Chris's momentum against him. A quick twist of the cane sent Chris sprawling face first into the dirt. Dust rose around him as he scrambled to get up, panic overtaking anger. Jake, the last one standing, hesitated. His eyes darted between his fallen friends and Walt, who now stood tall, his posture commanding respect. "Stay back," Jake warned, raising his hands defensively, though there was no mistaking the tremor in his voice. "I'm not going to hurt you," Walt said calmly, his tone firm but not cruel. "But I won't let you hurt me either." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he took a cautious step backward, glancing over his shoulder as if searching for an escape route. Walt didn't press further. He simply stood there, his breathing steady, his gaze unwavering. It was enough to make Jake turn and bolt down the alleyway, leaving his friends behind. Marcus groaned as he pushed himself up from the ground, wincing in pain. He looked at Walt, then at the cane in his hand, and finally at Chris, who was still struggling to stand. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of distant traffic and the rustling leaves above. You're crazy," Marcus stammered, pointing an accusatory finger at Walt. "Who are you?" Walt sighed, lowering the cane slightly. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet resolve. "I'm nobody special," he replied evenly. "Just someone who knows when to draw the line." Chris finally managed to scramble to his feet, brushing dirt off his clothes. He exchanged a nervous glance with Marcus, both of them clearly shaken. Neither had expected this outcome, not even close. They'd picked on plenty of people before, but never had they encountered someone like Walt. Someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. "Let's just go," Chris muttered under his breath, tugging at Marcus's sleeve. Marcus hesitated, glaring at Walt as if trying to figure out whether he should try again or cut his losses. Eventually, common sense prevailed. With one last scowl, he turned and followed Chris out of the alley, limping slightly as he went. When they were gone, Walt exhaled deeply, leaning on his cane for support. Only now did he allow himself a moment of reflection. His heart was racing, though not entirely from exertion. It was the rush of adrenaline, the same feeling he used to get during combat missions in Vietnam. He hadn't wanted to resort to violence, but sometimes standing your ground meant showing others that they couldn't walk all over you. As he bent down to pick up the spilled groceries, a small crowd began to gather at the edge of the alley. Neighbors who had been too scared to intervene earlier now peeked out from windows and doorways, whispering among themselves. Some stared in awe, while others clapped quietly, offering nods of approval. Walt ignored them, focusing instead on salvaging what he could from the mess on the ground. An apple here, a loaf of bread there. He didn't need much, but every little bit counted. One elderly woman approached cautiously, her hands clasped together. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, concern etched on her face. Walt gave her a small smile. "I'll be fine," he assured her. "Thank you." She lingered for a moment longer before retreating, shaking her head in amazement. Word would spread quickly about what had happened here today. And when it did, life in the neighborhood might change forever. But for now, Walt simply gathered his things, straightened his hat, and continued on his way, leaving behind 3 humbled bullies and a community buzzing with newfound admiration. By the time Walt reached his front steps, the story of what had happened in the alley was already spreading like wildfire through the neighborhood. People whispered to each other over garden fences, shared updates on phone calls, and posted snippets on social media. The image of a frail-looking elderly man taking down 3 armed bullies with nothing but a cane seemed almost too incredible to believe, but it was true. And everyone wanted to know more about the quiet, unassuming figure who had suddenly become the talk of the town. At first, Walt tried to ignore the attention. He busied himself with unpacking his groceries, carefully placing apples and bread on the counter. But it wasn't long before there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Harper, a kind-hearted neighbor who often brought him homemade pies, standing there with a warm smile. "Walter," she began, her voice filled with admiration, "you have no idea how grateful we all are for what you did today. Those boys have been terrorizing this area for months. You stood up to them when no one else would." Walt shrugged modestly, leaning against the doorway. "I just did what needed to be done," he said simply. "Nothing special." Mrs. Harper chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Nothing special. Walter, you disarmed them. With a cane. That's not something you see every day." Her words made Walt chuckle despite himself. "Well, I suppose I've picked up a trick or 2 over the years," he admitted cryptically, leaving the rest unsaid. As the day wore on, more neighbors stopped by to express their gratitude. Some left flowers on his porch. Others offered plates of food or heartfelt notes of thanks. A local news crew even showed up, hoping to interview him, but Walt politely declined. "I'm not looking for any attention," he told them firmly. "I only did what anyone else would have done in my shoes." But curiosity about Walt grew stronger. It started with casual conversations among residents. "Do you think he was in the military?" one person asked another. "He moves like someone who's trained." Someone else mentioned seeing old photographs in his living room during a holiday party years ago. Pictures of a younger Walt wearing a uniform and standing beside fellow soldiers. Eventually, a young college student named Emily, who lived down the street, decided to dig deeper. She spent hours combing through public records and archives until she uncovered the truth. Walter Johnson wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had served multiple tours overseas, earning medals for bravery under fire. During his service, he'd been part of elite reconnaissance missions, known for his quick thinking and leadership skills. After returning home, however, he chose to live a quiet life, rarely speaking about his past. When Emily shared her findings with the community, jaws dropped. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The calm confidence, the precise movements, the fearless demeanor. Walt wasn't just a hero in the eyes of his neighbors. He was a legend. People marveled at how such a humble man could carry so much history without ever boasting about it. Word traveled fast, and soon invitations poured in from various groups wanting to honor Walt. The local Veterans Association asked him to speak at their next meeting. A school principal requested that he visit classrooms to share his experiences with students. Even the mayor called personally, offering to name a park bench after him as a token of appreciation. Though overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect, Walt remained grounded. He didn't seek recognition, nor did he crave fame. What mattered most to him was the impact his actions might have on others, especially the younger generation. If his story inspired even one person to stand up against injustice or treat others with kindness, then it was worth every bit of attention. Still, he couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia as he sat on his porch later that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Memories of his comrades flooded back. The laughter they shared, the sacrifices they made, the bonds that transcended time. He wished they were here now to see how far he'd come since those days in the jungle. But deep down, he knew they'd be proud of him, not because he fought off 3 thugs, but because he never lost sight of the values they fought for: courage, integrity, and compassion. And as the neighborhood continued to buzz with excitement, Walt realized something important. Sometimes heroes aren't born, they are revealed. All it takes is one moment of bravery to remind the world of the strength within us all. The following Saturday, the community center was packed to capacity. Word had spread far and wide about Walt's story, drawing not only neighbors, but also curious visitors from nearby towns. The room buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, some carrying notebooks, others holding cameras or smartphones ready to capture the moment. At the front of the hall stood a simple podium adorned with an American flag, a subtle nod to Walt's military service. Walt himself sat off to the side, looking slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight. He wore his usual faded jacket, though Mrs. Harper had insisted on pinning a small American flag label to it for good luck. Despite his reluctance, he couldn't deny the sincerity in the eyes of those around him. These were people who genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say, and perhaps learn something valuable along the way. When the mayor introduced him, the applause was thunderous. Walt rose slowly, gripping his cane for support as he made his way to the podium. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed solely on him. For a moment, he simply stood there, gazing out at the sea of faces before clearing his throat. "I didn't come here to be called a hero," he began, his voice steady but warm. "What happened last week wasn't about me. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered most. But if sharing my story helps even one person think twice about how they treat others, then I'm glad to be here." He paused, collecting his thoughts. Then, in a tone that carried both wisdom and humility, he began recounting his experiences in Vietnam. He spoke of the dense jungles, the camaraderie among soldiers, and the sacrifices they made, not just physically, but emotionally. "War changes you," he said softly. "It teaches you things you never wanted to learn. Fear, loss, courage. They're all part of the same package." His words resonated deeply with the audience. Veterans in attendance nodded knowingly, while younger listeners leaned forward, captivated by every detail. Walt described moments of triumph and heartbreak, the friends he lost, the missions that tested his limits, and the lessons that stayed with him long after he returned home. "But war isn't the whole story," he continued. "When I came back, I chose to live quietly because I believed the best way to honor my comrades was to build a peaceful life. I focused on family, work, and helping my community, small acts that added up over time. That's what truly matters, not the medals or titles, but how we treat each other day by day." As he spoke, the room grew quieter, almost reverent. Even teenagers, who might have rolled their eyes at such a speech under different circumstances, listened intently. Among them were Marcus, Jake, and Chris, sitting near the back. They hadn't planned to attend, but guilt and curiosity had driven them to show up. Hearing Walt's words now, they exchanged uneasy glances, fidgeting in their seats. After finishing his reflections on Vietnam, Walt turned to address the neighborhood directly. "I know times are tough," he said. "People struggle, make mistakes, lash out when they feel cornered. But violence and fear don't solve anything. They only create more pain. Respect, understanding, and kindness. Those are the tools that can change lives." By the time he concluded his speech, the audience erupted into applause once again. Many wiped away tears, moved not just by his bravery, but by his message of hope and redemption. As Walt stepped down from the podium, several attendees lined up to shake his hand or thank him personally. Some shared their own stories of hardship. Others vowed to carry his lessons forward. Marcus, Jake, and Chris lingered awkwardly near the exit, unsure whether to approach him. Finally, Marcus mustered the courage to step forward. "Mr. Johnson," he called hesitantly. Walt turned, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. Marcus glanced at his friends, then back at Walt. "We just wanted to say sorry. For everything. We were wrong." For a moment, Walt studied them silently. Then, a faint smile crossed his face. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "Now go do better." And with that, the three young men walked away, humbled, inspired, and determined to prove they could change. In the weeks that followed Walt's speech, something remarkable began to happen, not just in the neighborhood, but within Marcus, Jake, and Chris themselves. The three young men had left the community center that day feeling a mix of shame and resolve. They knew they couldn't undo what they'd done, but they were determined to make amends, and Walt's quiet forgiveness had given them a starting point. At first, their efforts were clumsy and uncertain. Marcus suggested they clean up the graffiti-covered walls they'd once proudly tagged. Armed with buckets of paint and brushes, they spent an entire Saturday morning scrubbing away the colorful chaos that had become their signature. Passers-by watched skeptically at first, unsure whether this was some kind of prank. But as the hours passed and the walls transformed back into blank canvases, people began to take notice. "Looks like you boys are finally doing something useful," one elderly woman remarked dryly as she walked by. Her tone carried a hint of sarcasm, but there was also a flicker of approval in her eyes. Marcus forced a sheepish grin. "Better late than never, right?" The trio didn't stop there. Inspired by Walt's emphasis on helping the community, they started volunteering at the local food bank, sorting donations and packing boxes for families in need. At first, it felt strange. None of them had ever considered giving back before, but over time, they found a sense of purpose in the work. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Jake, who had always been restless and quick-tempered, discovered a surprising talent for organizing supplies. His knack for efficiency earned him praise from the food bank coordinator, which boosted his confidence in ways he hadn't expected. Meanwhile, Chris, who used to thrive on attention, found joy in quietly assisting elderly visitors, carrying heavy bags to their cars, or simply chatting with them while they waited in line. As word of their transformation spread, the neighborhood responded with cautious optimism. Some residents remained wary, unwilling to forget past grievances so easily. Others, however, chose to give the boys a second chance. Mrs. Harper, ever the optimist, even invited them over for homemade cookies one afternoon. Change doesn't happen overnight, she told them firmly but kindly. But if you keep working at it, people will see the effort. Their turning point came when they decided to visit Walt again, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted his guidance. Standing nervously on his porch, Marcus knocked lightly, half expecting Walt to turn them away. Instead, Walt opened the door with a curious expression. We wanted to thank you," Marcus said after a moment of awkward silence. "For everything. You could have called the cops on us, but you didn't. And well..." He hesitated, glancing at his friends for support. Chris stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We're trying to do better." "Really? But sometimes we don't know where to start." Walt studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Doing better is a choice," he said, "and it looks different for everyone. Start small. Be consistent. Show people through your actions, not your words, that you mean it." Over the next hour, the four of them sat together on Walt's porch, talking about life, mistakes, and redemption. Walt shared more stories from his time in Vietnam, not to boast but to illustrate the importance of discipline, accountability, and resilience. By the end of the conversation, Marcus, Jake, and Chris felt lighter, as if a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying had been lifted. True change wasn't easy, and setbacks were inevitable. There were days when old habits threatened to resurface, when frustration bubbled over or doubt crept in. But each time, they reminded themselves of Walt's example. Strength wasn't about being perfect. It was about getting back up every time you fell. Months later, the neighborhood celebrated its annual fall festival, a lively event filled with music, food, and laughter. This year, though, there was an added highlight: a special award ceremony honoring individuals who had made a positive impact on the community. When Walt's name was announced, the crowd erupted into applause. But what no one expected was the second announcement that followed. For their dedication to turning their lives around and contributing to our neighborhood, we'd like to recognize Marcus Johnson, Jake Miller, and Chris Turner, the mayor declared, gesturing toward the three young men standing near the stage. As they accepted their certificates, flanked by proud family members and neighbors, Marcus caught Walt's eye in the crowd. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Walt gave him a small, approving nod. It was enough. Enough to remind Marcus, and everyone else, that redemption wasn't just possible. It was worth fighting for. Years passed, and the neighborhood continued to thrive in ways no one could have predicted. The once quiet streets now buzzed with activity. Community gardens bloomed where empty lots had stood. Murals painted by local artists brightened dull walls, and weekly farmers' markets brought neighbors together. At the heart of it all was Walt, whose quiet strength and unwavering kindness had sparked a ripple effect that transformed not just individuals but the entire community. On a crisp autumn morning, years after the infamous alleyway incident, residents gathered in the park for a special dedication ceremony. A plaque had been installed near the entrance, its polished surface gleaming under the sunlight. Etched into the metal were the words, "In honor of Walter Walt Johnson, a quiet hero who taught us courage, compassion, and community." Beneath the inscription was a small engraving of a soldier's silhouette, a nod to his service during the Vietnam War. The turnout was overwhelming. Families, veterans, teachers, and even strangers from neighboring towns arrived to pay tribute. Marcus, Jake, and Chris were among the first to arrive, dressed neatly and standing tall as they helped set up chairs for the crowd. They weren't the same reckless teens anymore. They were young men who had grown into responsible adults, thanks in large part to Walt's influence. Marcus now coached a youth basketball team. Jake worked at the local library organizing workshops for kids, and Chris volunteered as a mentor for troubled teenagers. Each of them carried Walt's lessons close to their hearts, passing them on whenever they could. When Walt finally appeared, leaning on his trusty cane, the crowd erupted into applause. He waved modestly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but touched by the outpouring of love. As he took his seat near the front, children ran up to him, offering handmade cards and drawings. One little girl shyly handed him a picture of a man holding a cane, surrounded by smiling stick figures. "That's you, Mr. Walt," she said proudly. "You're everybody's hero." The ceremony began with speeches from community leaders, each sharing how Walt's actions had inspired change. The mayor spoke about unity, while a veteran recounted how Walt's story reminded him of the importance of camaraderie and resilience. But the most poignant moment came when Marcus stepped forward to speak. Clearing his throat nervously, Marcus looked out at the sea of faces. "I used to think I was tough because I scared people," he admitted, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But real toughness isn't about hurting others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Mr. Walt showed me that. He didn't have to forgive us, but he did, and because of him, we became better people. This community became better because of him." His words drew cheers and sniffles from the audience. When Marcus finished, he hugged Walt tightly, earning another round of applause. It was a powerful reminder of how far they'd all come, and how much farther they could go together. After the ceremony, Walt sat on a bench overlooking the park, watching as families played, laughed, and shared stories. Mrs. Harper joined him, handing him a cup of hot cocoa. "You've done so much for this place, Walter," she said warmly. "We wouldn't be here without you." Walt shook his head, smiling slightly. "This wasn't my doing," he replied. "It was everyone working together. All I did was remind folks of what they already had inside them." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Walt felt a deep sense of peace. His life hadn't been perfect. He'd faced loss, hardship, and pain. But he'd chosen to focus on hope and healing instead. Looking around at the vibrant community he helped nurture, he realized his legacy wasn't written in plaques or awards. It was in the smiles of children playing tag, the laughter of friends reunited, and the quiet determination of those striving to make the world a little brighter. That evening, as Walt settled onto his porch to watch the stars, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of his comrades from Vietnam, the neighbors who'd become family, and the 3 young men who had turned their lives around. Despite the challenges he'd faced, he knew he'd lived a life worth living. Not because of medals or recognition, but because he'd made a difference, one small act of courage and compassion at a time. And as he leaned back in his chair, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves and distant hum of crickets, Walt smiled. His work may have been done, but his impact would endure for generations to come.